Hello and welcome to our series on essential pillars of trustworthy AI. My name is Pamela Gupta and I'm joined here with my esteemed guest. You may know her already, Debbie Reynolds. Hello, Debbie.
Hi, Pamela. Very nice to see you, and thank you for inviting me on your program. So my name is Debbie Reynolds. I'm the founder, CEO, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I like to say I work at the intersection of technology, regulation, especially as it relates to emerging technologies. That's something I really like to work on, and I advise many companies around the world on these issues.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm very interested in hearing your views on a topic that is extremely important, as we know, for AI in general. And when we talk about trustworthy AI, then privacy becomes even more pivotal. So let me give the viewers a quick background on what this series is and what we are going to be covering. As I said, I'm your host, and I'm excited to be here talking about a really important and essential topic for AI today. Artificial intelligence, as you know, is becoming and has been a part of our environment, of our society, part of our basically any existence in a digital and in non-digital form for some time. And the important thing that is worth highlighting here, why trustworthy AI is important, is twofold. One is it is pervasive. It is in areas that we may not even realize. So this is a dialogue to action series. So the dialogue part is to focus on where all does it exist even, right? And what can we do, and who can actually. The most important thing is who can do what needs to be done, right? If there are issues, firstly, let's realize and recognize what they are, highlight what those are. But I'm not going to spoil and give the punchline away. But one thing that is extremely important is who can do something about the issues, because it's not obviously and always going to be the impacted parties, right? In this case, us as consumers. So the series is really in the intent of the series is to focus on for organizations. How can we build trustworthy AI? What those essential pillars are? And also, how can we build this in without becoming so large and so unfathomable? And how do we put our arms around the issues, and how do we address those issues? So, Debbie, very happy to have you here, as I said, and I'd like to talk to you about a couple of what the current landscape is, for example, and where do we go from here?
All right, so I guess I'll talk about, the current regulatory landscape. Is that what you want me to talk about?
Yes, let's start off with, what do you see as privacy? Well, how do you define it?
Yeah. So to me, I define privacy as rights of individuals. And what we're seeing in the world is that regulations that are being passed are trying to create more rights, more ways for people to have agency around their data. And as a result, companies have to adjust to these new rights that people have because companies are using data of individuals. So the challenge is a shift away from companies collecting data just for whatever their product or service is, but now they have what I like to call like a data stakeholder. So now individuals have a stake they, in my view, have a seat at the table now in terms of not only the product or service that a company provides, but then also how a company protects the data that they have of the individual. So this is a huge shift in the way that the organizations have been working in the past. Before it was like, okay, we have a product or service, we collect this data, and then it's a black box. So we don't have to be transparent. We don't have to tell people what's happening in the background. And that is kind of the bigger challenge. But on top of that, now we have all this automation. We have all these cool technologies with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And what it's doing is it is turbocharging companies' ability to do things with data that they never were able to do in the past. So part of the reason why we're focused and you're focused in this area is because now that we have the capability to do things, faster or better, more complex ways, it becomes even less transparent a lot of times, and the harm can be exponentially more, more painful, more harmful to the individual. So having people like you in the place to be able to advise people about how they can be responsible with AI and do it in a way, first of all, not to harm or hurt people, and then also to be able to be transparent and really make it an advantage and not a risk to corporations or organizations that try to go along this path. Like, it's part of, for me, like digital transformation.
Okay, that's really that's good to hear in terms of, and thank you for kind of delving into what is trustworthy AI, right? And what are those elements? What do we really mean when we say trusted AI or trustworthy AI? For me, it is a combination of not only twofold. One is that we are aware of what we are building, and we're building it conscientiously, because these are high impact systems. We will not have a chance to go back and retrofit or change aspects without having dire consequences. There are so many data elements, and that's something I want to talk to you about also, as to when we even look at what is PII, for example, right? What is personally identifiable information? That's a very key term and concept for privacy. How can AI play a role in that, right? Okay, let me explain one thing, the question a little bit. If PII is something that we hold as something that we want to protect, and in a trustworthy AI and trusted systems, we want to make sure that PII is protected, right? Our identity, our and beyond identity, and we'll go into that, right? Because you mentioned that we are turbocharging these systems. We are collecting so much data, and it at some point is going to come back, and it's going to be a question of, this is what we what we call data spillover, right? In this case, we collected so much data, it was for a particular purpose, but now look at this data, we can use it to monetize it and give give a better user experience, or make more money, right, as an organization. If we because we already have the data, how can we do more from the data we have, for example, right? So, but to just step back for a minute, why we need trustworthy AI, and how we define trustworthy AI is, does the system do what it is supposed to do, and is that intention really clear, right, at an organization level, whether it's the management or the front lines?
Yeah.
That's what I have for you.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. So when people are using AI systems, they need to be clear. And this, to me, the foundation of this is probably data literacy. So I think people unfortunately are data illiterate, don't know what what data is supposed to do and what data is supposed to tell them. But in an AI situation, you should be able to have a goal of what you think the artificial intelligence should be helping you see. And so as a result, when you're looking at the results of what an AI system can put out, if that output is unexpected in some way and possibly harmful, you may have a problem there, right? So if you don't have a proper foundation for what you're trying to look for, you don't have a proper idea of what you think the AI and the result should be, that should be a point where companies need to reassess what they're doing, because probably the AI system is doing something that probably could be harmful to someone, and at the most, and at least not being as transparent as you need to be about what exactly it is that this AI system is supposed to be doing.
So, Debbie, do you think that companies today are incentivized to take a look at that transparency and be transparent, have that privacy by design concept ingrained in their approach?
I feel like the water is rising on companies on this. So I think in the past, there was no incentive at all because companies, once the data was absorbed by a corporation or company, they didn't have to say what happened to the data. They didn't have to, they could keep things forever. And so what we're seeing, regulations creep in and they're saying, hey, don't keep data too long, be transparent, let us know what you're using, especially if you're going through AI systems. We're seeing movement, especially in the EU, and definitely, some movement in the US around trying to create more responsibility and accountability in their use of AI systems, because when someone is harmed by an AI system or as a result of something that's done in AI, you can't unharm someone, right? So once you fall off the cliff, you can't unfall off the cliff. So being able to understand the full impact and the view of technology, you can't just look at the benefits, you also have to look at a risk. So for me, I think AI is like a double-edged sword. So the sword cuts both ways, good or bad. So you have to be able to look at not only the beneficial things to organizations and why they use AI, but then also you have to be able to assess what the potential harm is. And I think the only way you can do that is create transparency through that whole process.
I agree with that. That without, so intent, what is the intention? To be clear as to what is the data being collected. I mean, that's what we have been doing, right? And I won't say we've been doing it right, but that has been the intent, right? I mean, that has been the focus and target for a long time, that don't collect data you don't need. That has been our conventional advice. Now, let me tell you one thing that I think will be kind of an eye-opener for our audience, okay? Which is this, my latest post on LinkedIn on this essential pillars of trustworthy AI. Cybersecurity was the first one, second is privacy. And there I mentioned some research from and proof that came out of, Stanford. And this was, I don't want to pick on companies, but this was very eye-opening, that for data that we may not even realize. Remember, I was talking about PII, right? This is data we want to protect. We know what is personally identifiable information. We know what is sensitive data. We know what is private data. But I think the challenge comes from the fact, what we think of sensitive data, that scope just keeps increasing, right? And can be very, very context driven, right? So for example, the research I'm talking about in this case is this data scientist, and he's at Stanford. He's talked about and showed how just looking at a picture of a person, the AI algorithms were highly accurate, even more than people who might be our partners or are people who are really close to us, whether it's your spouse or your family, the kids, your parents, whoever it may be, that it was shown that these algorithms are actually predicting things more accurately even than the people we are really, really close to and by just looking at a picture, at your facial, whether what we're posting on Facebook or LinkedIn or videos that we are recording even here, for example. And they were able to tell two things that I think are extremely important for people to know, which are sexual orientation as well as political orientation. And I was like, what? How is this? What are how, what are you talking about? But then it showed for example, some proof of what that was. Okay, if you're supporting a particular political person. I didn't know that could be a tongue twister, but I just made it one. Uh, but that is not something you would be potentially even be looking at. Okay, this is data elements we've gathered about, let's say, even if you anonymize the data, right? And you don't have a particular, you can't identify a particular person, but just looking at this data that you're collecting, you can gather that, let's say this particular organization or this area has more of a certain sexual orientation. You can see how, even if we take the right measures for conventional privacy protection, right, of PII, in this case, biometrics, facial recognition, or the face picture or a photograph, how it can really unravel conventional methods of privacy and data collection, even as we define it, can quickly unravel, because this is not something we were even thinking of. This is data we already collected. Okay, we're protecting the identity of the person. We don't know that this picture is for Pamela Gupta, for example, but just looking at some of the features, and we can tell that she is her sexual orientation, where it may be, if it's a discriminated area, some places, in some countries, a lot of countries, in fact, where sexual orientation may play, maybe even deadly, right? If you are of a certain sexual orientation, you could be killed for that, right? That's how critical we can make these areas of these data stores, going from just a nice to have or something to protect us, how it takes new meaning, right? So to get back to the why the conventional systems are not going to work, or conventional controls, and something even as simple as a snapshot in time, such as audits, etc., will not work, is a point I'm making, Debbie. I'd like to know what you think. What do you think about that? Am I far off, or what do you think?
No, well, the problem, you're right on. So I think the problem with AI and AI systems is that AI tries to predict something in the future based on what happened in the past or what it knows about someone in the past. And so I think it shouldn't be used, especially as a replacement for human judgment, right?
Yeah.
And then also companies, maybe this goes toward your thought about spillover, right? So, why would you even need this information to begin with? Are you going to do something with this information that's going to create a harm for someone, right? So there was an example in Europe, a case, I think it's still ongoing, about a credit bureau that only had the name and the address and the sex of a person, and they denied someone credit because of that. So they didn't have any information about their credit worthiness or anything, but they put they basically recommended that this person be denied credit. So what is that all about, right? So without actually knowing anything about someone's credit worthiness, what is the AI system doing in that situation? So those are the types of harms that people can have in AI systems. And this is one reason why we're seeing regulations regulations are going towards people, companies not being able to fall back on saying, this is our secret sauce. This is like, protected IP. And so we're not going to tell you. It's like, well, the harm that is coming from your system means that we do need to know, why these systems make these decisions, because you're creating harm, with people. So I think, your point is right on. We need to know more about what these systems are doing, why they're doing it, why you're even collecting this information and what inferences are being made about individuals in the future.
Yeah, I agree that the fallouts and they can be unintended outcomes, right? So, in my first opening slide, I talked about, let me share that again, which is the essential pillars for building trustworthy AI. And there are two things I talk about here, which I just want to highlight so that we can kind of see why those are important and what they are, what I even mean by that, right? That what is, the two things. One is we cannot get the full intended benefit, right? We are going to be building these systems out. We are using the data. We have so much data that can be both good and bad if we are not careful. But we cannot realize the full potential of AI without building trust in AI. That's one. And the other is we cannot achieve the intended outcomes without building trust in AI. So I think those two go hand in hand in terms of why we need to be very, very, very careful of what is the data we are collecting, right? How we are storing it, and who are the decision makers in an organization. Because especially when it comes to what can be built and what is the unintended outcome, right? We don't want to be surprised by unintended outcomes, because here we are starting out on this journey of, as a business owner or as a board of an organization, that this is what we want to achieve, right? Now you have come out with the unintended outcomes, which were not, firstly, they're not going to help, with the business goals. Secondly, they can be detrimental to the financial as well as brand image, but at a very, very, very high scale. So for example, one example that you probably heard of a lot of times now is the Apple credit card, right? And the Goldman Sachs, they're creating the ability for checking the credit worthiness and not, and approve and create the scale of, for Apple. So this was the scenario, the context. But it ended up that is the couple that had the same exact financial credit worthiness, right, and credit scoring. The male got a much better higher score and a higher score than the wife. And even though she had actually a much better financial record because of the gender bias, okay? The odd thing was that Goldman was not even focusing on gender. That was not one of the data elements they were collecting, but the algorithms were able to deduce that, create inference on that based on other data elements. So what does that mean then? That if we want intended outcomes, in this case, it was to create the creditworthiness. They wanted to have take a look at certain data elements. But what the algorithm also looked at was create, things such as the gender, and came to its own, drew a conclusion, which was the unintended outcome, right? How can privacy help in that scenario? I think the purpose of this whole series is to take a look at those two things that you mentioned in the beginning, that it's a double-edged sword, right? Privacy can be a double-edged sword because we do want creditworthiness. And in order to do that, we have to go take a look at financial data and private data, right? And get the creditworthy, which is really an intrusion into your privacy to begin with, right? But we do want that. How do we do that in a way that can be done securely, safely, with privacy, and not have unintended outcomes? I think, in my view, that is the challenge of the day, and we do need to be able to leverage our prior experience in this space, but we will need a little bit of more out of the box thinking, or forget the box. There is no box. We have to just sometimes start all over again, because some of these things are not going to be even handled by privacy by design, in my view. So
Right.
welcome your thoughts on that.
I think some of, especially your example about the whole credit worthiness thing, I'd even back it up farther than that, not just Goldman Sachs or Apple, they're probably repurposing algorithms that have been used for decades in other credit systems. So that was just a very visual example. Maybe there are two people who live in a house next to each other and they have the same credit score, but then they get different, credit worthiness. But, this was just a very pinpointed example. I think, understanding bias is really important. A lot of people don't believe bias exists, and we know that it does. So being able to, that transparency in those systems those systems were built in ways that were not transparent, even we still have people talk about FICO scores, that's still not transparent, right? But I think that those systems now will have to be transparent. And that's why this example that I gave is probably, the credit agency should be concerned about it, because for many decades, they've had this sort of black box nature about how they do things. It's been very accepted, but we see that there's a lot of bias there. And so I'm hoping that more transparency in AI will help illuminate what that bias is and be able to adjust for that, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Well, certainly a lot of things have changed. Some things are going to be the same. So some basic concepts, of what we are collecting and how we're collecting data in an organization, that is a given, right? I think the two things that, that I would like to kind of mention as a takeaway, right, from this is the game has changed and will continue to change. So old methods, yes, common sense and old golden principles, we do need them, but we also have to keep our hand on the pulse and see where we are going with this. What would be your advice in terms of emerging risks and how it relates to what is practical and actionable going forward?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway that I have for organizations is that if you think that things are going fine and you can just do business as usual without making any adjustments as it relates to this, then you are sadly mistaken, right? So there's so much that is changing outside in the world. There's so much new technology that's coming into corporations by, whether it be companies wanting to move into new emerging spaces or being forced to because they have to automate. So I think that companies need to see that the calculus is changing a lot, right? Regulators are really looking more closely at what corporations or what organizations are doing with AI. I think the big data days, in my view, are over. So the big data concept was, let's just collect as much as we possibly can and keep it as long as we want. That is not going to be the way of the future. So companies need to be a bit more circumspect and purposeful about what they collect, why they collect it. And then being able to create transparency through this whole process is really important. So I think if companies can shift from the idea that, the data that they have of an individual belongs to that individual and doesn't belong to the company, it will help them adjust to this new level of transparency that they need to have in the future.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to catching up with you on other issues as we come across them. So thank you very much, Debbie.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.